They say you never forget the moment someone makes you feel small. But what if that moment happened 35,000 feet above the ground, where there's nowhere to walk away, and the whole world is watching? Picture this: a crowded first-class cabin, a flight attendant doing her job with quiet grace, until a passenger sneers, "I don't want her touching my food." The room freezes, phones rise, silence falls heavier than the clouds outside. Now imagine it's you standing there in her place. Would you bow your head and swallow the humiliation to keep your job, or would you find the strength to look that hate in the eye and say, "No more"? This isn't just a story about an argument on a plane. It's about courage, about a choice between fear and dignity, and it's about one captain whose decision changed everything and proved that decency still exists in the sky. Because sometimes, the smallest act of respect can echo louder than thunder. Stay with me. Like this video, share it with someone who believes in what's right, and subscribe for more true stories that will remind you humanity still flies among us. The cabin lights shimmered softly, a golden haze over first class. A hush hung in the air, broken only by the faint hum of the engines and the delicate clink of glassware. Somewhere near the front, a man's laughter cut through the quiet, sharp, dismissive, the kind that made your stomach tighten. Then it happened. A flash of red, the sharp scent of wine, a gasp that spread like ripples through still water. The glass had flown from Charles Denton's hand, spilling across the air before it struck. Crimson wine splattered over the Navy uniform of Flight Attendant Aisha Carter, running down her collar, staining her neatly pressed shirt. The world seemed to stop. Even the hum of the engines felt distant, swallowed by shock. Charles leaned back in his seat, his voice low but loud enough to carry, "People like you should know your place." Every word dripped with poison. Aisha froze, the glass still in her hand. Her chest rose and fell, but her voice stayed trapped somewhere between rage and heartbreak. Around her, passengers exchanged looks, phones rising slowly like silent witnesses. Seat 2A. That's where Marcus Hall sat. He'd been reviewing a speech on his tablet, a keynote for a diversity summit in Los Angeles. Of all things, when the wine hit, he blinked once, twice, trying to decide if this was really happening. A man of composure, of measured logic, Marcus had learned to control every flicker of emotion in public. But at that moment, his fingers curled into fists. He knew that look on Charles's face. He'd seen it before in boardrooms, in restaurants, in the eyes of people who smiled while denying him a seat at the table. The cabin was silent now. You could hear the slow drip of wine falling onto the carpet. A child whispered, "Mom, what happened?" Her mother gently covered her eyes. Aisha finally spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "Sir, that was uncalled for." Charles scoffed. "Don't start with your attitude. Maybe try doing your job right next time." Her lips parted. She wanted to respond, but decades of warnings echoed in her mind. Don't talk back. Don't escalate. Smile. Stay calm. Survive. So she stood there, the perfect picture of professionalism, though her uniform was soaked in humiliation. And then a voice, deep, firm, and calm. "This is your captain speaking." The cabin fell utterly silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Captain Evelyn Ross's voice carried through every speaker like thunder wrapped in velvet. "Our crew deserves respect. Every single one of them. No exceptions, no excuses. No tolerance for anything less." A collective shiver passed through the cabin. Charles blinked, glancing around as if to confirm she was talking about him. Passengers stared, phones tilted up. The world was watching. But before anyone could move, the captain's door clicked open. Heavy footsteps echoed down the aisle. Aisha looked up, startled. Marcus straightened in his seat. Charles shifted uncomfortably. "Oh, come on. This is ridiculous. I just—" The footsteps drew closer, slow, steady, unhurried. Then Evelyn appeared, a tall woman in her late 40s, posture perfect, 4 golden stripes gleaming on her shoulders. Her expression was unreadable. She stopped right beside Charles's seat. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the hum of the engines filled the silence. "Sir," she said finally, her voice low, deliberate, "you will not raise your voice. You will not insult my crew, and you will not remain on this aircraft under these conditions." Charles's jaw dropped. "Excuse me, I paid for first class, and you'll land in custody if you continue." Evelyn replied, "Respect is not a service upgrade, sir. It's mandatory." Gasps fluttered through the cabin like a wave. Aisha's lips trembled. She wasn't used to being defended. Not like this. For years. She'd swallowed moments like this one, smiling through prejudice, hiding the sting. But right now, standing beside Captain Ross and seeing the quiet fury in her eyes, she felt something shift. She felt seen. Marcus exhaled, his heartbeat finally slowing. In his mind, he heard his late grandmother's voice. "Child, the world won't always change because you're angry, but sometimes it changes when someone finally refuses to stay quiet." Charles's smirk began to fade. He leaned back, trying to recover his composure. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. "It was an accident." The captain didn't blink. "You spilled hate, not wine." A murmur spread through the cabin. One passenger whispered, "Damn, that's leadership." The captain turned toward Aisha. "Ms. Carter, are you hurt?" Aisha shook her head. "Just embarrassed." Evelyn nodded slowly. "You have nothing to be embarrassed about." She straightened, looked around the cabin, and said clearly, "We will handle this matter accordingly. Thank you for your patience." Then she met Marcus's eyes. For a brief moment, something passed between them, a silent understanding between people who'd carried the same invisible weight. As the captain turned to leave, Marcus spoke quietly, almost to himself. "She's not the one who should be embarrassed." Charles glared at him. "You stay out of this." Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "You already made it everyone's business." Phones kept recording. Aisha turned away, finally allowing herself a deep breath. The wine was sticky on her skin, but her spirit felt lighter somehow, as if the shame no longer belonged to her. The captain's voice returned on the intercom moments later. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Ross. Please remain seated. We'll be addressing a passenger conduct issue shortly. Thank you for your cooperation." The lights dimmed slightly. The hum of the engines returned, softer this time, like the sky itself was exhaling. Marcus looked out the window. The clouds rolled beneath them, endless and white. He thought of the irony how high they were, and yet how low humanity could sometimes fall. He didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. Before the flight touched the ground again, everything, his beliefs, his patience, even his past would be tested. And somewhere between the clouds and the earth below, justice would find its wings. Morning light spilled through the tall windows of JFK Airport, catching on the silver trim of rolling suitcases and polished shoes. The air smelled of roasted coffee and hurry. Travelers moved with purpose, their faces lit by phone screens and departure boards. Somewhere among them, Marcus Hall stood in line, calm and neatly dressed in a tailored navy suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He wasn't just another business traveler. He was the founder of Solvra, a green tech company changing the way small cities used renewable energy. But this morning, he didn't feel like a visionary. He felt like a father who missed home. He pressed the phone closer to his ear. "Morning, Pumpkin. You ready for school?" His daughter's sleepy voice came through the speaker. "Almost. You're still going to the awards thing." "Right I am," Marcus said softly. "They're honoring Solvra for sustainable innovation." "You proud of your old man? I was already proud," she said. "But bring me back one of those mini cookies from the flight." He smiled. "Deal. Behave for Grandma." As he hung up, his reflection in the glass caught his eye. Behind the calm smile was something heavier, a memory of his first business trip when a client had mistaken him for the driver. He'd laughed it off then, but he'd carried the sting quietly ever since, across the terminal. Aisha Carter stood at the crew counter, adjusting her uniform with care. She always took an extra moment before each flight, a ritual that grounded her. Her hands smoothed the crisp navy fabric, her eyes tracing the golden wings pinned over her heart. They'd once belonged to her mother, who had served 30 years in the skies. Aisha touched them lightly. "Another day. Mama, help me fly right." "Morning, Aisha," said Jennifer, one of her colleagues. "You ready for another full house?" Aisha smiled. "Always. What's the route, New York to non-stop? Captain Ross herself." "Oh," Aisha said, straightening. "I've never flown under her command before." Jennifer lowered her voice. "You'll like her. Tough as they come. But fair. Like, really fair." Inside the pilot's lounge, Captain Evelyn Ross studied the flight plan projected on her tablet. Outside the window, sunlight glinted off the aircraft's silver skin. She'd been flying for 25 years, long enough to have seen the industry change, though not always for the better. Her co-pilot, Andre, looked up from his notes. "Full flight," he said. "We've got some VIPs in first class. Then we'll treat them like everyone else," Evelyn replied, with professionalism, not privilege. Andre smiled. "You're setting a high bar as usual. That's the only altitude I fly," she said, checking her watch. At Gate 47, passengers gathered as the final boarding call echoed over the loudspeaker. Aisha positioned herself by the boarding door, greeting each person with that same gentle warmth that made nervous travelers feel at ease. She liked the human part of her job, the small kindnesses, the smiles, the stories that made flying more than a routine. And then Charles Denton appeared. He wore a charcoal suit and an expression that said the world should move faster for him. His silver cufflinks glinted like small weapons. "First-class check-in," he barked at the gate agent. "And don't wrinkle the bag. It's custom." The agent smiled politely. "Of course, Mr. Denton." Charles didn't thank her. He never did. As he approached the aircraft, Aisha greeted him. "Welcome aboard, sir." He gave her a quick glance, eyes traveling from her face to her uniform and back again. "You people sure get younger every year." "Excuse me." He smirked. "Nothing. Just saying standards used to mean something." Aisha's smile stayed fixed, though she felt the familiar sting beneath her ribs. She gestured to his seat. "Right this way, sir." He brushed past her, muttering something about hiring quotas, from his seat nearby. Marcus caught the exchange. His instincts stirred the same quiet anger that always came when someone turned dignity into a weapon. But he stayed silent, reminding himself he was here to relax, to stay above it. He'd learned that people like Charles Denton thrived on reaction. Still, when their eyes met briefly, Marcus saw it. The man's disdain wasn't subtle. It was studied, deliberate, and practiced. Aisha moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts, offering smiles that didn't reach her eyes. She saw Marcus watching her, and for a second, their gazes met. He gave a small nod, not pity, but recognition. It was the kind of look that said, "I see what you're carrying, and I respect your strength." She nodded back, silently grateful. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Evelyn's voice came over the intercom. "Good morning. Crew, today's flight to Los Angeles is approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes. Weather's clear all the way across. Let's make it a smooth ride, folks." Her tone was steady, confident, the voice of command that made everyone sit a little straighter. Charles leaned back in his seat and flagged Aisha with a snap of his fingers. "Miss, bourbon? Neat." She turned to him. "Right away, sir," he muttered. Finally, when she handed him the drink, he didn't thank her. Instead, he inspected the glass like he expected it to fail him. Then he whispered just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Used to be only professionals in first class. Now it's anyone with points." Marcus closed his eyes. He told himself to breathe, to stay calm. But a quiet question rose inside him. How long do we keep letting moments like this slide? As the plane taxied down the runway, engines rumbling beneath them, Aisha stood by the galley, watching the clouds through the small window. She whispered under her breath, "Just get through today." At that exact moment, in the cockpit, Evelyn Ross looked out at the horizon, the endless blue stretching ahead. Something in her gut told her this flight would be different. She didn't know why, only that the air felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. "Ready for takeoff," Andre said. "Let's take her up." Evelyn replied. The aircraft surged forward, wheels lifting, gravity falling away. The city shrank beneath them. The morning sun flooded the cabin, and as Flight 473 climbed toward its cruising altitude, none of them knew the sky itself was about to test their humanity. They didn't yet realize that by the time they landed, reputations would be shattered, courage would be defined, and silence would no longer be an option. Because respect, like flight, only holds when everyone rises together. The plane leveled smoothly at cruising altitude, sunlight spilling through the small oval windows like warm ribbons of gold. The hum of the engines was steady, almost soothing, a heartbeat that held hundreds of lives in rhythm. In first class, leather seats gleamed beneath the light. Soft music drifted overhead, the kind that pretended everything in the world was calm. But calm is a fragile thing. Marcus Hall glanced up from his tablet, eyes skimming over financial projections that suddenly felt meaningless. Across the aisle, Charles Denton was already restless, fidgeting with his cufflinks, sighing loudly, the kind of sigh meant to be heard. His arrogance filled the cabin as surely as the air itself. Aisha Carter, poised and professional, moved gracefully through the aisle with the beverage cart, every motion precise. She'd done this 1,000 times, but not every flight carried the same weight. She smiled at the first passenger, offering coffee and tea with quiet warmth, her voice calm. When she reached Charles, his expression didn't shift. He looked at her the way one might look at a stain on glass. "You again," he said flatly. "What happened to the other attendant?" Aisha's smile remained, though her chest tightened. "I'm here to assist you today, sir. Would you like something to drink? Bourbon?" he said curtly, waving his hand as if brushing away an insect. "Neat. And make sure it's not that cheap brand." "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice steady as stone. Marcus's jaw tensed. He'd promised himself he wouldn't get involved, but watching her hold her dignity together while this man chipped at it made his hands curl into fists again. He leaned back, forcing himself to breathe, to wait. Charles took the drink without a word of thanks. He swirled it once, sniffed it, and said, "You'd think for what we pay, They'd hire people who know quality. The sentence hung in the air like smoke. Aisha didn't react, but Marcus saw her shoulders stiffen slightly. She turned to the next passenger, a young woman reading a magazine, who gave her a sympathetic glance. When Aisha smiled back, it wasn't the easy kind. It was the kind people use to hide pain. Minutes later, Charles pressed the service button again. The light blinked above him, insistent. Aisha returned quickly. "Yes, sir." He pointed at the blanket folded neatly on his lap. "This isn't the right texture. Get me another." "Certainly," she said. She retrieved a new one, soft and untouched, and offered it with both hands. Charles took it, brushed the fabric with his thumb, and then said under his breath, "Still wrong, but I don't expect much these days." Aisha hesitated just a fraction too long, and he caught it. Something to say, he asked, a smug grin forming. She looked him squarely in the eyes. "No, sir. I just hope you find it comfortable. For a heartbeat." His smirk faltered. Something in her composure unsettled him, the grace that refused to bow. Across the aisle, Marcus watched every moment. The CEO inside him analyzed behavior, tone, power dynamics. The man inside him felt anger bloom like fire under ice. He'd been here before, different faces. Same poison. The assumption that wealth excused cruelty. He thought of his daughter and how one day she might walk into a room where someone like Charles would decide she didn't belong. He unbuckled his seatbelt, pretending to stretch, giving himself a reason to move closer. "Excuse me," he said casually to Aisha. "May I have another coffee black, please?" Aisha nodded, grateful for the interruption, even if she didn't say it. "Right away, Mr. Hall." When she returned, Marcus met her eyes as she poured. "You're handling it with grace," he murmured quietly, careful not to be overheard. She blinked, startled, then whispered back, "It's part of the job." Marcus shook his head. "No, it's more than that." She didn't reply, but her throat tightened. Kindness in the middle of humiliation could break a person faster than cruelty. Charles cleared his throat loudly, drawing attention back to himself. "Excuse me?" he said to no one in particular. "I believe my seat isn't reclining properly." Aisha approached, checking the control panel. "It's functioning, sir. You may need to press and hold the button for a few seconds. I know how to use a seat," he snapped. "Just fix it." Before she could respond, the passenger behind him, a middle-aged woman with a kind face, spoke up. "Sir, I think it's working fine. Mine reclines the same way." Charles turned toward her sharply. "Did I ask for your opinion?" The woman flushed, sinking back into her seat. Marcus had seen enough. He stood up, slow and deliberate. "Sir," he said calmly, "she's doing her job. Maybe show a little respect." Charles's head turned, his expression hardening. "And who the hell are you?" "Just another passenger who knows decent behavior when he sees it," Marcus replied. The air thickened. Aisha stepped quickly between them. "Gentlemen, please," she said quietly. "Let's keep things calm." Charles laughed without humor. "Calm? Oh, I'm perfectly calm. I just don't appreciate incompetence or being lectured by someone who should mind his own business." Marcus didn't move. His voice was low, steady. "Then stop making your business everyone else's." For a long moment, their eyes locked, privilege against patience, arrogance against control. Then Charles looked away, muttering under his breath. Aisha exhaled softly, her hands trembling just a little as she pushed the service cart back toward the galley. When she disappeared behind the curtain, Marcus sat again. His pulse was fast, but his conscience was clear. He glanced at the window, the clouds rolling by beneath them, endless and white. Aisha leaned against the counter in the galley, eyes closed. She could still hear Charles's voice echoing in her head. The insults didn't surprise her, they rarely did, but Marcus's defense had, not because she needed saving, but because it reminded her that not everyone looked away. Jennifer appeared beside her, whispering, "You okay? I'm fine." Aisha said softly, "I just need a minute." Jennifer nodded. "That guy's trouble. You want me to take his section?" Aisha shook her head. "No, I'll handle it. I always do." She straightened, fixed her uniform, and stepped back into the cabin. The smile returned to her face, not fake, not quite real either. The smile of someone determined to finish what she started. Charles glanced up as she passed, his expression a mixture of irritation and curiosity. He didn't know it yet, but his small cruelty had set something unstoppable in motion, a chain reaction that would end in a way he could never imagine. Marcus watched her walk by, graceful and steady, and something inside him settled. Whatever came next, he knew he wouldn't stay silent. Not this time, at 35,000 feet. The sky was quiet, but in that quiet, a storm was forming. The seatbelt light dimmed to a soft amber glow as Flight 473 reached its full altitude. The world outside stretched in endless cotton-white plains, clouds rolling beneath the plane like waves of quiet snow. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady and constant, but for Marcus Hall, the silence inside his chest was anything but calm. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, watching the steam from his coffee swirl like smoke in the light. Across the aisle, Charles Denton shifted, snapping open the in-flight magazine as if it had offended him. His fingers drummed against the armrest, impatient, restless, self-satisfied. The air in first class had changed. Every small sound seemed sharper now. Aisha Carter re-emerged from the galley with the elegance of someone who refused to let anyone see her shaken. Her uniform was perfect again, her posture straight. But her eyes, if you looked closely, carried the weight of something she refused to let fall. She moved through the aisle with practiced ease, checking seatbelts, refilling drinks, offering quiet smiles. Most passengers met her kindness with gratitude. Some avoided her eyes. Uncomfortable with what they'd witnessed earlier, Marcus noticed the pattern, the avoidance, the pretend ignorance. He'd seen it before in boardrooms when people pretended not to hear a racist remark, convincing themselves silence was neutrality. It wasn't. Silence was permission. Charles finished his bourbon and pressed the call button again. The chime was small, but it might as well have been a gunshot in the hush of the cabin. Aisha appeared moments later, calm as ever. "Yes, sir," she asked politely. He gestured at the empty glass. "Another? And maybe this time, don't make me wait." Her tone remained gentle. "Of course, sir." As she turned, Charles added, "You know, I remember when airlines cared about presentation. There was a standard. Not just anyone could wear the uniform." Aisha froze for the smallest moment. The words weren't new. They were echoes of a lifetime's worth of small humiliations, dressed up as conversation. She looked at him, her voice soft but clear. "Sir, I take pride in representing this airline." He smirked. Pride doesn't polish glassware. The woman seated across the aisle, Mrs. Parker, glanced up, frowning slightly, but she said nothing. Marcus clenched his jaw, every muscle in his body telling him to stand. But Aisha didn't want saving. He could see that. She wanted respect. When she returned with the drink, her movements were slower, deliberate. She placed the glass carefully on his tray, meeting his gaze. "Here you go, sir." Charles lifted it, swirling the amber liquid. You sure this is top shelf?" "Yes, sir." It's the premium selection. He sniffed it dramatically. Tastes cheap to me. Like the service. Marcus shut his tablet, unable to pretend anymore. That's enough, he said, his voice firm but even. Charles turned, eyebrows raised. Pardon, she's doing her job, and she's doing it better than you're behaving. A low murmur passed through the cabin. A few passengers looked up, eyes darting between them. Charles laughed, the sound sharp. Oh, I see what this is. You're one of those. Always looking for a reason to be offended. Tell me, is it some kind of solidarity thing Marcus didn't move? It's a decency thing. Aisha stepped between them again, her tone steady but pleading. Gentlemen, please, let's keep things civil. I'm perfectly civil, Charles snapped, but I don't need lessons in manners from. He stopped himself, but the damage was already done. The pause was louder than any word he could have said. The ugliness hung there, half-spoken, fully understood. Aisha's composure didn't crack. Would you like me to bring you something to eat, sir? He smirked. I've lost my appetite. Marcus leaned back, his jaw tight, fighting to keep his voice low. You should be grateful she hasn't lost her patience. Charles's eyes narrowed. Careful, son. You don't know who you're talking to. Marcus smiled faintly. I know exactly who I'm talking to. Aisha could feel eyes on them from every direction. Phones weren't out yet, but she knew they would be if this continued. She had seen enough viral flight videos to understand how quickly moments turned ugly. And yet, part of her wanted the world to see how ordinary cruelty looked when dressed in fine suits and quiet entitlement. The intercom crackled softly. Captain Evelyn Ross's calm voice filled the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now at cruising altitude. Please relax and enjoy your flight. Cabin crew, continue regular service. Her tone was composed, but Aisha caught the faint edge in it, the intuition of someone who sensed tension even from behind the cockpit door. In the galley, Jennifer whispered. You okay? Aisha nodded, though her throat felt tight. I'm fine. He's just another one. Jennifer frowned. He's worse than most. You want me to tell the purser? No, Aisha said quickly. If I make a report, it'll turn into paperwork, meetings, and questions about whether I handled it professionally. I'll handle it my way. Her way, Marcus thought later. Was Grace under fire? An hour passed. The cabin settled, passengers immersed in movies and laptops. But peace doesn't last long at 35,000 feet, not when arrogance has no ceiling. Charles raised his voice suddenly. Miss, my napkin is wet. Aisha approached again, already weary of his tone. I can replace it for you. Sir? He thrust the damp napkin toward her. Do that, and maybe try not to spill this time. Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. Marcus's eyes followed every movement. The restraint she carried was heroic. He'd given speeches about leadership, about equality, but watching her in that moment taught him more than any lecture he'd ever written. A few rows back, Mrs. Parker whispered to her husband, someone should say something. Her husband replied quietly, It's not our place. Marcus turned slightly, hearing the words, Not our place. That phrase had built centuries of silence. It echoed through him, familiar and heavy. When Aisha returned with a new napkin, Charles barely looked up. He muttered something that sounded like, finally, and went back to his drink. But for Marcus, the moment was no longer about irritation, it was about truth. The truth that some men carried power like a weapon, and others carried dignity like armor. He stared out the window again, watching the clouds stretch endlessly below. Somewhere beyond those clouds was the ground where reality lived. But up here, There was no escape, only mirrors. Aisha caught his gaze once more. He offered a small, knowing nod. She didn't smile this time. She simply held his eyes, and in that unspoken exchange, something solidified a shared understanding that before this flight ended, silence would no longer protect anyone. Charles shifted again, sighing heavily. "I swear, service gets worse every year," he muttered. "Back when I used to travel for business, people knew their place." Aisha walked away before she could hear more. Her chin high. Marcus whispered to himself, "So do I." Outside, the sun tilted toward the horizon, painting the clouds orange and rose. The beauty of the sky was almost cruel in contrast to what simmered below. The flight attendants prepared for the dinner service, unaware that in less than an hour, the calm veneer of the flight would shatter, and every passenger on board would remember this journey not for where it went, but for what it revealed about who they were. At 35,000 feet, the air was thin. But the truth was getting thicker by the minute. Dinner service began with the calm rhythm of clinking plates and soft laughter. But underneath that pleasant surface, tension pulsed like a hidden current. The light in the cabin had softened, glowing golden against the walls. The scent of roasted chicken and buttered rolls drifted through first class. For a moment, everything looked normal again. Too normal. Aisha Carter moved gracefully down the aisle, balancing a tray like it weighed nothing. Her smile was small but steady, her professionalism intact. Only someone watching closely like Marcus Hall could see the faint tremor in her left hand. He admired her strength. He also feared what that strength cost her. Charles Denton had been quiet for 20 minutes, long enough for people to start breathing normally again. Maybe the bourbon had finally done its job. Maybe. Marcus hoped he was done humiliating her. But arrogance doesn't rest. It just waits for the right moment to strike again. When Aisha reached Charles's row, he looked up lazily. "You again," he said, his tone thick with alcohol and disdain. "Guess I don't get to choose who serves me anymore." Aisha stayed calm. "Your dinner, sir. What's on the menu?" "Herb chicken or grilled salmon, both served with vegetables and mashed potatoes." He smirked. "Figures. You people love seasoning everything." Several passengers nearby froze. A soft gasp escaped from someone in row 2. Aisha's eyes didn't waver, though her heart beat like a drum inside her chest. "Would you prefer the chicken or the salmon, sir?" He leaned back, studying her with cruel amusement. "Tell me something. Do they make you smile like that in training, or is that just part of the act?" "It's part of my professionalism." He grinned. "Right. Professionalism. You're good at pretending. I'll give you that." Marcus's patience cracked. "Sir," he said quietly, his tone low but sharp. "That's enough." Charles turned his head slowly. "And there's the hero again. You've crossed every line a decent man shouldn't." "Decent man." Charles laughed, shaking his head. "You don't get to lecture me about decency. I've been flying since before you were running your first diversity workshop." The jab hit deeper than Charles knew. Marcus's jaw clenched, his mind flashing back to every time someone had reduced his achievements to charity or quota. Aisha spoke softly, trying to diffuse. "Gentlemen, please." But Charles wasn't done. He picked up his fork, speared a piece of chicken, chewed it dramatically, and then spat the words. "This tastes like it was cooked in an alley. Tell me, sweetheart, did you make it yourself?" Aisha blinked. The insult wasn't even clever, it was just meant to hurt. She placed her hands behind her back, her knuckles whitening. "If the food doesn't meet your expectations, I can bring another option." He snorted. "Yeah, maybe bring someone who actually knows what they're doing." The words someone and actually carried the poison. The meaning was unmistakable. Across the aisle. Mrs. Parker sat up straight, no longer able to pretend she didn't hear. Sir, that's uncalled for. Charles turned on her with a sneer. Mind your own business. Lady. Marcus stood. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. No, he said, voice steady, controlled, but hard as iron. She's right. You're done talking to her like that? Charles laughed, raising his voice now. Sit down, son. You don't make the rules here. I'm not your son. Then act like a man and mind your own seat. Aisha stepped in between them, her voice trembling slightly but still strong. Please, Mr. Hall, sit down. It's okay. No, Marcus said softly, his eyes on Charles. It's not okay. It's never been okay. Charles chuckled. Oh, look at that. The righteous speech. Go ahead. Tell us all how oppressed you are while sitting in first class. That's rich. Marcus's voice lowered. You think this is about comfort? This is about respect. Something you wouldn't understand if it hit you in the face. Charles slammed his palm against the tray table, making the wine glasses jump. You better watch yourself, boy. The word hung there, sharp as glass. The passengers went silent. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade away. Aisha's heart stopped. She saw Marcus's fists tighten at his sides, his knuckles white, every muscle screaming for release. But he didn't move. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled through his nose, grounding himself. Captain Ross, Aisha whispered into her small earpiece, her voice shaking. We have a situation in first class. The captain's calm voice replied instantly. Copy that. What kind of situation? Passenger harassment? Escalating. There was a pause. I'm on my way. Charles wasn't finished. What? You calling your boss on me now? He raised his voice, turning toward the others. See this? This is the world we live in now? You can't say anything without someone crying discrimination. Mr. Parker leaned over his seat, his voice firm. No, sir. This isn't about saying anything. It's about throwing hatred in the air we all have to breathe. A few passengers clapped softly. Others murmured agreement. For the first time, Charles looked uncertain. But arrogance dies hard. He lifted his glass again, muttering, ridiculous. When Captain Evelyn Ross appeared at the front of the cabin, the atmosphere shifted. She was tall, composed, her uniform immaculate, her presence commanding. She moved with quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to shout to be felt. Good evening, sir, she said to Charles. I understand there's been an issue. Charles leaned back, crossing his arms. Oh, here we go. Another one? You people really travel in packs, don't you? The captain's eyes didn't flicker. Excuse me, I said. This is absurd. I was just giving feedback about the food, and now suddenly I'm a criminal. She overreacted. Evelyn's tone turned crisp. There are 30 witnesses, sir. Would you like to keep pretending they didn't hear what you said? Charles opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Marcus spoke. Captain, with all respect, I saw everything. I can confirm he's been verbally harassing her since takeoff. Evelyn nodded. Thank you, Mr. Hall. She turned to Aisha. Are you all right? Aisha swallowed hard, her voice quiet. Yes, ma'am. Charles barked a short laugh. Oh, she's fine. Tough girl. Probably used to this kind of thing. The sound that followed was a collective gasp. Evelyn's expression hardened. Sir, that's enough. You're violating FAA regulations by interfering with a crew member's duties. Oh, come on. Sit down and do not speak again. Her command voice filled the air like thunder. Even Marcus felt a chill. Charles looked around, realizing he'd lost the crowd. He reached for his glass again, his hand trembling slightly. "You're all insane," he muttered. Evelyn turned to her first officer through her headset. "Notify ground control. We're filing an incident report and requesting security at landing." Then, addressing the cabin, "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disturbance. We appreciate your patience as we handle this matter." She gave Aisha a nod of reassurance before returning to the cockpit. But the moment wasn't over. Not yet. Charles glared at Aisha as she walked away. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "People like me don't get treated like this." Marcus leaned toward him. "Maybe that's the problem." Charles turned, his face red. His face. "You think you're better than me? You're just another—" He stopped when Marcus's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "Finish that sentence," Marcus said quietly. Charles's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, he had no words. The plane flew on through darkening skies, turbulence shaking the cabin gently as if the heavens themselves disapproved. Aisha returned to the galley, her hands finally shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. Jennifer touched her shoulder. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. "I think I am. But it shouldn't take a captain to make it stop." "No," Jennifer said softly. "It shouldn't." Aisha leaned against the counter, tears pricking at her eyes. She wasn't crying out of fear now. It was exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying dignity on your back through a storm. In the cabin. Marcus stared out the window again, the lights of cities faint below. He thought of his parents, his company, the speeches he gave about equity. He'd told others to be brave, to speak up. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, he'd remembered what that really meant. The engines hummed, the sky held steady. But inside, everything had changed. This was no longer just a flight. It was a mirror, one showing who people were when decency was tested at 35,000 feet. And before the night was over, that mirror would shatter completely. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane sliced through the night sky, a silver arrow gliding over a sea of darkness. The hum of the engines was constant, but beneath it lay the heavy silence that followed humiliation. The air smelled faintly of coffee, steel, and tension. Aisha Carter stood in the galley, her hands trembling as she poured water into a glass. She stared at her reflection in the metal cabinet uniform perfect, eyes red. She whispered to herself, "Hold it together." She had faced worse before: backhanded compliments, silent stares, whispered slurs, but this time was different. This time, everyone saw it, and for once, someone had stood with her. Marcus Hall. His quiet courage lingered in her mind like a song she couldn't forget. In the cockpit, Captain Evelyn Ross listened to the hum of the instruments. Her face was calm, but her pulse raced. She'd seen the footage already. Jennifer had forwarded a short clip from a passenger's phone. It showed Charles Denton leaning over his tray, his voice loud, his words dripping with entitlement. The captain replayed it in her head, every cruel syllable echoing against decades of her own silence. She had been a woman pilot when there were barely any. When passengers asked if she was qualified to fly, she'd learned to keep her head down, let professionalism speak louder than pride. But now, watching what happened to Aisha, she realized silence was no longer professionalism, it was complicity. Her first officer, Tom Jensen, glanced at her. "Everything all right up here? Captain, everything's under control." She replied, but not for long. He frowned. "You're thinking of turning back, aren't you?" Evelyn didn't answer. She was thinking about leadership, about the responsibility that came with those 4 gold stripes on her shoulder. She thought about the promise she made years ago that no one under her command would ever face injustice alone. She pressed the intercom button. "Jennifer, tell Ms. Carter. I'd like to speak with her for a moment." Aisha entered the cockpit a minute later, standing at attention. "Captain." Evelyn turned her chair slightly, meeting her eyes. "You okay?" Aisha nodded automatically, then hesitated. "Not really." Evelyn's voice softened. "That man disrespected you. He disrespected this crew. And that means he disrespected me." Aisha blinked. "Captain, I don't want to cause trouble." Evelyn leaned forward. "Trouble's already here. The question is, do we let it land quietly, or do we face it while we're still in the sky?" Aisha's throat tightened. "Ma'am, I've dealt with passengers like him before. If I file a complaint, it'll go through HR, maybe a written apology, and that'll be it. People like him never really face consequences." Evelyn studied her for a long moment. "You might be right, but not tonight." She turned to Tom. "You have the controls." Tom's eyes widened. "Captain, what are you doing? Something I should have done years ago." She unbuckled her harness, her expression unreadable. Minutes later, the cockpit door opened, and the cabin went completely silent. Every head turned as Captain Evelyn Ross stepped out, her gold stripes gleaming, her posture straight as an arrow. Her presence filled the aisle like a force of nature. Charles Denton looked up, frowning. "What now?" Evelyn stopped at his row. Her voice was even, steady. "Mr. Denton, I'm Captain Ross. I understand there's been an incident." He smirked. "An incident? You mean a misunderstanding? That woman overreacted." "That woman," Evelyn repeated quietly, "has a name. It's Ms. Carter, and she's part of my crew. You don't talk about my crew like that. Ever." Charles rolled his eyes. "Oh, for God's sake. Are you serious? I just made a few comments about the food. This whole plane's acting like I started a riot." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "You verbally assaulted one of my attendants, interfered with her duties, and created a hostile environment for multiple passengers. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a violation of federal law." The color drained slightly from his face. "You can't be serious." Over a few words, Evelyn's voice was calm, but her tone carried steel. At 35,000 feet, words carry weight. They decide whether people feel safe or humiliated. And on my aircraft, safety includes dignity. The cabin was utterly still. Marcus Hall watched, his heart pounding. For once, someone in authority wasn't letting it slide. Charles's tone turned desperate. "Look, I'm a loyal customer, Platinum Elite. I spend thousands with this airline." "Then you should know our policy," Evelyn said evenly. "Respect is non-negotiable. Your loyalty points don't buy you a license to hate." A soft murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers nodded. A few started filming. Evelyn folded her arms. "Sir, under FAA regulations, I have full authority over this aircraft and every person on it. You violated Section 46504 of the United States Code. That means I can remove you from this flight immediately or divert this plane back to New York for law enforcement to meet us." Charles's voice cracked. "You'd turn the plane around for this, Evelyn said, her eyes narrowing. "Because what happened isn't about one insult. It's about the kind of world we all choose to tolerate." He swallowed hard. I didn't mean it like that. It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did." He stared at her, mouth half open. "You're ruining my life over a comment." "No, Mr. Denton," she said quietly. "You did that yourself." Evelyn turned to Aisha. "Ms. Carter, are you willing to make an official report?" Aisha hesitated only a second. "Yes, Captain. Good. Then that's what we'll do." Charles shot to his feet. "You can't throw me off mid-air." Evelyn didn't blink. "Watch me." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. She turned toward her headset. "Control. This is Captain Ross. Flight 473. We're declaring a non-emergency security incident, requesting immediate clearance to return to JFK. Tom's voice came through the earpiece. "Copy, Captain. Turning us back now." The engines adjusted, and a subtle shift pressed everyone into their seats. Passengers looked at one another, realizing what was happening. The flight was turning around. Charles sputtered. "You're insane. Do you have any idea what this will cost?" Evelyn met his eyes. "Not as much as your integrity already has." Someone started clapping softly, then another joined. Within seconds, the sound grew a wave of applause spreading through the cabin. Aisha's breath caught. She'd spent her whole career staying quiet, smiling through disrespect, believing silence was survival. But now, watching her captain take a stand, she felt something bloom inside her. Pride, relief, justice. Marcus looked at her and smiled. "She did the right thing," Aisha whispered. "She did the brave thing." Outside, the night sky stretched endless and dark, but inside the plane, something brighter had taken hold, a flicker of change, of defiance, of hope. Charles slumped in his seat, the realization sinking in that his money, his arrogance, his status couldn't save him this time. He turned toward Marcus, voice shaking. "You think this makes you better?" Marcus replied softly. "No, it makes us equal." The plane descended through a layer of clouds, city lights glowing faintly below. The captain made one final announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are returning to New York due to a passenger interfering with crew operations. We apologize for the delay, but as always, our priority is safety, physical and human." There was silence. Then, another round of applause. Louder this time. When Evelyn stepped back into the cockpit, Tom gave a low whistle. "That's going to be all over the news." "Good," she said. "Maybe it'll remind people that respect still has altitude in the galley." Aisha finally sat down, exhaustion washing over her. Marcus passed by on his way to the restroom, stopping briefly. "Thank you for handling yourself the way you did." She smiled faintly. "Thank you for speaking up." He nodded. "You showed more strength than most CEOs I know." She laughed quietly, the sound fragile but real. "You don't get to quit mid-flight." The plane continued its descent toward New York, and though it had only been a few hours, everyone on board knew something irreversible had shifted. For the first time in a long while, Aisha felt seen not as a uniform, not as a role, but as a person, and somewhere deep inside, she knew this wasn't just a flight home, it was the beginning of something new. The city lights of New York shimmered beneath the descending aircraft like scattered jewels on black velvet. The plane trembled slightly as it dropped through a patch of thin clouds, the hum of the engines deepening. The voice of Captain Evelyn Ross came through the speakers again, calm and firm, echoing across the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be touching down shortly. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Law enforcement will meet us at the gate." The words sent a quiet ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged looks, some anxious, others relieved. Phones were out again. Messages being sent, posts being drafted. History was being recorded in real time. Aisha Carter stood in the galley, her pulse steady now. For the first time in hours, her fear had faded. In its place was something far stronger, a quiet certainty that what happened tonight would matter. She checked the coffee pots, the meal trays, anything to keep her hands busy, but her mind kept replaying the captain's words. "Respect is non-negotiable." Jennifer looked over, smiling softly. "You know this is going to go viral." "Right." Aisha exhaled slowly. Maybe it should. You think corporate's going to back her up? Aisha's eyes lifted to the ceiling, as if the answer were somewhere above the clouds they'd just left. They have to. If they don't, we all lose. In the cabin, Marcus Hall sat still, hands folded in his lap. The businessman in him was already processing what came next. Legal reports, media statements, headlines, but the human in him was simply humbled. He'd watched courage take form tonight, not in shouting or revenge, but in the quiet grace of a black woman who refused to bow and a leader who refused to stay silent. Charles Denton, meanwhile, sat motionless in 3A, his complexion pale under the cabin lights. His phone buzzed repeatedly in his pocket, but he didn't dare answer. Sweat glistened on his forehead. His arrogance had drained away, replaced by the cold realization of consequence. He tried to speak to the flight attendant passing by, but she didn't stop. For once, no one cared what he had to say. The wheels touched the runway with a soft thud. The cabin shook gently, then steadied. Gasps of relief rippled through the rows, followed by restrained applause. It was the kind of applause that carried more than gratitude, it carried respect. "Welcome back to New York," Captain Ross said over the intercom. "Please remain seated while law enforcement boards the aircraft." Moments later, the forward door opened. The rush of cool air filled the cabin, along with the presence of authority. 2 federal air marshals stepped inside, badges gleaming. Their movements were efficient, their expressions unreadable. One of them, a tall woman with dark hair pulled tight, spoke clearly. "Mr. Charles Denton." He looked up, frozen. "Yes, please stand and come with us." "Sir." "This is ridiculous," he said, trying to sound composed, but his voice cracked. "You're treating me like a criminal." The marshal's response was flat. "Interfering with a flight crew is a federal offense." "Sir, you'll have an opportunity to speak once we're on the ground." "I am on the ground," he snapped. "Then start walking." He stood reluctantly, his expensive shoes scuffing against the carpet. Every eye in the cabin followed him as he moved down the aisle. Some passengers recorded, others simply watched. The sound of the handcuffs clicking around his wrists was faint but final. A child in the middle rows whispered, "Mom, are they arresting him?" Her mother nodded quietly. "Yes, honey, because what he did was wrong." As Charles disappeared through the cabin door, the silence he left behind was heavy but peaceful. It was the sound of justice, long delayed but finally delivered. Marcus looked toward Aisha, who was standing near the galley. Their eyes met again, and in that simple moment, everything that had been broken in the air seemed to settle. She gave a small nod, acknowledging not victory, but survival. When the last passenger disembarked, Aisha lingered. The captain joined her, clipboard in hand. "You did well tonight," Evelyn said gently. "I didn't feel brave," Aisha admitted. "That's what makes it real." The captain replied, "Bravery doesn't feel like courage. It feels like doing what's right when every part of you wants to disappear." Aisha smiled faintly. "What happens now?" "Paperwork. Investigations. Probably a lot of headlines." "Do you think they'll try to spin it?" "They can try," Evelyn said, slipping her hat under her arm. "But the truth has altitude now." Marcus approached them before leaving. "Captain Ross, Miss Carter, thank you both. You didn't just handle a passenger tonight. You handled a history that's been repeating itself for far too long." Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. "Mr. Hall, thank you for speaking up." He shrugged lightly. "Silence is comfortable, but it's never harmless." Aisha looked at him with quiet gratitude. "I won't forget what you said to him, or what you didn't say." Marcus smiled. "Words aren't always needed." Sometimes it's just standing up. As he walked away, Evelyn turned to Aisha. You know, there's something about nights like this. They remind you why you started, why you still wear the uniform. Aisha looked down at her wings pinned over her heart. It used to just be about flying. She said softly, "Now it's about something higher." The captain placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then keep flying, Ms. Carter. The sky needs people like you." Hours later, after reports were filed and the cabin was empty, Aisha walked through the quiet terminal alone. Outside the large windows, rain had begun to fall, streaking the glass with silver lines. She stopped, gazing at the reflection of the runway lights shimmering in the puddles. For the first time in a long while, she felt light-free. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number appeared. "This is Marcus Hall. I wanted to thank you again for your grace tonight. The world needs to see what leadership looks like at 35,000 feet. Aisha smiled and typed back, "Leadership takes all kinds. You did your part too." He replied, "Maybe, but you did it with wings." She laughed softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. Somewhere in the terminal, she could hear the faint echo of applause still replaying in her head. It wasn't for her alone, it was for every person who'd ever swallowed their dignity just to keep their job, for every voice that had gone unheard. Outside, a new aircraft lifted into the sky, its lights slicing through the rain. Aisha watched it rise, the engines roaring with purpose. "Fly safe," she whispered. "Fly proud." In that moment, she knew this was only the beginning, because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it lands quietly on a runway glistening under the rain, in the heart of a woman who finally remembered her worth. By morning, Flight 473 had become a headline. Video clips flooded social media the moment Captain Evelyn Ross confronted Charles Denton. The applause, the arrest. Millions watched, commented, argued. Some called it justice served. Others called it an overreaction. But one thing was certain, no one was silent. Aisha Carter sat in her small apartment in Queens, the early sunlight spilling through the blinds. The city outside was just waking up, traffic humming softly, sirens far in the distance. Her phone vibrated nonstop, texts from colleagues, messages from strangers, journalists asking for interviews. She ignored them all for now. The world had opinions. She just wanted a moment of peace. Her reflection in the mirror looked different today. The same uniform lay folded neatly on the chair beside her. But something had changed inside her eyes. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was recognition. The kind that comes after surviving something heavy and walking out the other side stronger. Jennifer called, her voice bursting with energy. "Girl, you're everywhere. CNN, NBC. Even late-night shows are talking about you." Aisha sighed softly. "I didn't ask for any of this. I know. But you earned it. You showed the world what dignity looks like in real time." Aisha leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. "You think they'll try to twist it? The airline? I mean..." Jennifer paused. "They might. But Captain Ross isn't the type to let that happen." At that same moment, across town, Captain Evelyn Ross stood in her office at JFK headquarters. The walls were lined with photos from her career, decades of flying, medals, certificates. Her superior, a middle-aged executive named Robert Gaines, sat behind his desk, hands folded, expression unreadable. "Captain Ross," he began. "You caused quite a storm last night." Evelyn met his gaze calmly. "I did my job." He nodded slowly. "You understand, though. The company's under pressure. We're being called heroes and villains in the same sentence. Corporate wants to issue a statement, something neutral. Neutral, she repeated. A man harassed a member of my crew. I enforced federal law. What exactly is there to be neutral about? Gaines sighed. Public relations is delicate. We don't want to alienate anyone. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Respect isn't a demographic, sir. If we start choosing who deserves it, we've already lost. He stared at her for a long moment, then sat back. You've always been difficult to argue with. I take that as a compliment. He allowed a small smile. As you should. Then, after a pause, he added, the FAA called. They're backing your decision completely. Mr. Denton's facing federal charges. He's already on the no-fly list. Evelyn's shoulders relaxed for the first time that morning. Good. When she left the office, reporters were already waiting outside. Microphones flashed. Questions flew through the air. Captain Ross, did you overstep protocol? Do you believe the passenger deserved arrest? How does it feel to be called America's hero pilot? She stopped for a moment, choosing her words carefully. It's not about being a hero, she said. It's about remembering that kindness and respect are part of safety. The sky belongs to everyone, but dignity must always come first. The clip would be replayed hundreds of times that day. By afternoon, Marcus Hall sat in his company's boardroom overlooking downtown Manhattan. His assistant scrolled through a news feed on the large screen. A video of him on the plane had surfaced too, his quiet defense of Aisha, his confrontation with Charles. The comments below were a storm of praise and reflection. That's what leadership looks like. We need more men like him. Marcus wasn't interested in fame, but he understood opportunity when it arrived. Prepare a statement, he told his team. Not about me, about respect in the workplace, about accountability. And make sure we highlight the flight crew. They deserve the credit. He leaned back, thinking about Aisha. He hadn't known her before that flight, but somehow she'd reminded him why his company existed in the first place, to build, not divide. He picked up his phone and sent a short message. Saw the coverage? You carried yourself with grace, proud to have witnessed it. Aisha read it hours later as she sat at a cafe, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. She smiled faintly and typed back, it wasn't grace, it was survival. But thank you. Survival is grace, he replied. The doorbell above the cafe jingled. Captain Ross walked in, still in uniform. Aisha blinked in surprise. Captain, mind if I sit? Of course not. They sat across from each other, two women who had seen too much sky, too much silence. Evelyn ordered coffee. You've handled all this with remarkable calm. I'm trying to. Honestly, I just want to go back to work. You will, Evelyn said, but not the same way. None of us will. What do you mean? Evelyn smiled gently. Do you know how many young women, especially black women, are going to apply to be flight attendants because of you? They've seen someone stand tall in uniform. You gave them a mirror. Aisha looked down, her eyes glistening. I never meant to make a statement. Real statements never start that way. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the sound of coffee cups clinking softly around them. Outside, the city moved fast as ever. But in that tiny corner, time felt slower, like the pause between storms. A man at a nearby table recognized them. Excuse me, he said, approaching hesitantly. Are you the flight attendant and the pilot from Flight 473? Evelyn exchanged a look with Aisha. Yes, she said simply. The man nodded. I just wanted to say, thank you. My daughter's a flight attendant. She's dealt with things like that. You showed her. She doesn't have to just take it. Aisha's voice was soft. Tell her she doesn't, ever. He smiled and left. And for the first time, Aisha allowed herself to breathe deeply, the kind of breath that comes after years of holding it in. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low over the skyline, she walked along the East River. The wind was cool, the water glittering. Her phone buzzed again, this time a notification from a major airline union. Flight 473 crew, honored for exemplary conduct in upholding equality. Aisha laughed quietly to herself. Equality at 35,000 feet, she whispered. Not bad for one long night. At the same moment, in a quiet bar near the airport, Evelyn sat alone, watching a replay of her press statement on the TV. A younger pilot approached, nervously. "Captain Ross, I just wanted to say, that was incredible." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you. You made it clear. We're not just responsible for safety, we're responsible for humanity." She raised her glass slightly. "That's the real altitude, across the city." Charles Denton sat in a holding room, hands still cuffed, staring at the floor. The arrogance was gone. For the first time in years, he felt small. He thought about the woman's calm eyes, the captain's steady voice, the applause. Shame settled heavy in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he'd finally learned something the hard way. That night, the city lights reflected off the Hudson. Planes traced thin silver lines across the dark. Somewhere among them, a new flight took off a different crew, a different story, but the echoes of Flight 473 remained in the air, carried on invisible wings, because sometimes justice doesn't come with anger or noise. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet conviction of those who refuse to look away. And for Aisha, Evelyn, and Marcus, the sky would never be just sky again. It was a reminder of what happens when ordinary people choose courage at 35,000 feet. Weeks passed, yet the story of Flight 473 refused to fade. It became more than a viral headline. It became a conversation. News outlets replayed the footage, podcasts dissected the incident, and classrooms used it as a case study in ethics and equality. But for those who lived it, the noise outside was nothing compared to the quiet transformation within. Aisha Carter was back in uniform. The first time she stepped into the terminal again, she felt her pulse race, a whisper of fear mixed with pride. People recognized her now. Some smiled, some nodded, a few stopped to thank her. But fame wasn't what she wanted. What mattered was that she had earned the right to stand tall without apology. Her colleagues greeted her with warmth. Jennifer hugged her tightly before the next flight. "You ready for round 2?" she teased. Aisha smiled. Always. As they prepared for boarding, she caught her reflection in the aircraft window. The same wings pinned to her chest shimmered faintly in the morning light. They looked heavier now, but in a good way, like medals earned through fire. When passengers began boarding, a man in his 40s stopped by the door. "Are you Ms. Carter?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He extended his hand. "My wife's a flight attendant. She showed me your story. She said you reminded her why she started flying." Aisha felt her throat tighten. "Tell her thank you for staying in the sky." The man nodded and stepped inside. The flight was routine, smooth, almost uneventful, but every now and then, Aisha caught people looking at her, as if they were seeing not just an attendant, but a message. Respect had found a face. In the cockpit, Captain Evelyn Ross adjusted her headset. She had flown hundreds of flights since that night, but the memory of Flight 473 lingered like contrails behind her. She still received letters from pilots around the world, men and women who said her actions reminded them of what command truly meant. Leadership wasn't about hierarchy, it was about humanity. During the quiet stretch over the Atlantic, Evelyn spoke over the intercom, her voice calm and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We're cruising at 35,000 feet. Weather looks clear ahead, and we're expecting a smooth ride. Please sit back, relax, and remember, courtesy and kindness make every journey better." It was a simple message, but every word carried weight. Some passengers smiled. A few clapped quietly. Down in first class, Marcus Hall reclined in his seat. It wasn't coincidence he was on this flight again. He had waited for an opportunity to see Aisha and Captain Ross once more. His company had partnered with the airline for a corporate diversity initiative inspired by their story. But more than business, he wanted to thank them both properly. When the seatbelt sign switched off, Aisha approached with the same calm grace as before. "Mr. Hall?" she greeted, surprised but pleased. "Didn't expect to see you here again." He grinned, couldn't resist flying with the most famous crew in America. She laughed softly. "You might be exaggerating." "Not at all. You changed the way people see us. That takes strength." Aisha tilted her head slightly. "It takes more than strength. It takes witnesses." He nodded. "Thoughtful. Maybe. But you turned witnesses into believers." Their conversation was interrupted by a chime, the familiar service bell. For a second, both froze, memories flashing. Aisha's eyes flicked toward the aisle, but this time, the passenger was an elderly woman asking for a blanket. Aisha smiled and hurried to assist her. When she returned, Marcus said quietly, "You handled that with grace." She smirked. Occupational hazard. Later, during the meal service, Captain Ross made her usual round through the cabin. When she reached Marcus, he stood and shook her hand. "Captain Ross, I never got to say this properly, thank you." Her expression softened. "You said it that night. Mr. Hall, you spoke up. That's what mattered. I just followed your lead." He replied. She smiled faintly. "We all followed something that night. Conscience has altitude, too." Hours passed. The sky outside shifted from deep blue to gold as they crossed into daylight. Aisha took a brief break in the galley, sipping coffee and staring out the small window. She thought about how life had changed. Before that flight, she had doubted her place in the world. Now she understood her place was wherever she stood with integrity. When she looked down at the ocean far below, its surface glimmering like glass, she realized that justice didn't always roar in headlines or handcuffs. Sometimes it lived quietly, in people who refused to shrink. She remembered something her grandmother used to say, "Some storms come to clear the air, not destroy the sky." That night on Flight 473 had been that storm, and now the air finally felt clean. Captain Ross's voice came through the speaker again. "Crew, we'll begin our descent in 20 minutes. Thank you for another safe flight." Aisha smiled, adjusting her uniform. "Another safe flight," she murmured, though she knew it meant more than safety. Now it meant dignity intact. Hearts lighter, skies fairer. As the plane descended, Marcus gazed out the window, lost in thought. He was no stranger to turbulence, both in business and life, but this had been different. He'd seen leadership in its purest form. It reminded him of something his mother used to tell him: "People remember how you made them feel long after they forget your name." He knew now that everyone on Flight 473 would remember how it felt to witness courage at 35,000 feet. When they landed, applause rose softly again, habitual yet meaningful. Aisha felt tears prick at her eyes. Even after all this time, that sound still reached her soul. As passengers disembarked, one young woman stopped and whispered, "Thank you for standing up that night. I was on that flight. I didn't say anything, but I'll never forget what you did." Aisha's voice caught. "You don't have to say anything. You remembered. That's enough." When the last passenger left, Captain Ross joined her at the door. Feels different, doesn't it? Aisha nodded. Like the air's lighter. Maybe it is, Evelyn said with a smile. Maybe we finally earned it. They walked together through the jet bridge, sunlight pouring in from the windows, the sound of engines fading behind them. It felt like closing a chapter not of pain, but of transformation. Outside the gate, cameras flashed again. Reporters still followed them, but this time, the questions were softer. Captain Ross, Ms. Carter, what's next for you both? Evelyn glanced at Aisha, then said simply, we keep flying. That evening, as twilight settled over the city, Aisha stood on her balcony, watching a plane climb into the orange sky. She whispered to herself, keep flying, and smiled. Because she understood now the sky wasn't just a place to work, it was a place to prove that even in thin air, humanity could breathe. The morning air over Atlanta shimmered with quiet promise. The airport hummed, as always, 1,000 lives crossing paths without knowing it. Somewhere in that constant motion, Aisha Carter walked through the terminal, her steps steady, her spirit lighter than it had been in months. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a symbol now, though she never wanted to be one. Posters of her smiling face hung in the airline's employee hallways. Courage at 35,000 feet. The story of Aisha Carter and Captain Evelyn Ross. It wasn't vanity. It was a reminder to every crew member walking past that respect and dignity weren't optional. They were oxygen. Today wasn't just another flight. It was the official launch of the airline's new diversity and leadership program, named the Ross Carter Initiative. Cameras flashed as executives gathered for a small press event near Gate 32. Captain Evelyn Ross stood at the podium, calm and commanding as ever. When we talk about safety in aviation, Evelyn began, we often mean turbulence, weather, or engines. But real safety, emotional safety, human safety starts with respect. On Flight 473, we learned that dignity is not negotiable. Not at 35,000 feet, not on the ground, not anywhere. Applause filled the terminal. Marcus Hall stood off to the side, smiling. He had flown in from Chicago to attend, representing his foundation that had helped fund the initiative. When Evelyn stepped away from the microphone, she gestured for Aisha to join her. Aisha hesitated for a second. Even now, public attention made her uneasy. But as she stepped forward, the sound of clapping grew louder, and she felt that same fire she'd discovered on that unforgettable night, the courage to stand tall. She looked around the room, young flight attendants, engineers, janitors, executives all watching her. That night, Aisha began softly, I didn't think about courage. I just thought about surviving with my dignity intact. But survival isn't enough anymore. We need to make sure no one has to choose between silence and self-respect again. She paused, voice trembling slightly. We all have a flight we're on somewhere we're trying to go, and sometimes turbulence comes in the form of prejudice, ignorance, or fear. But just like any good crew, we have to steady the plane, protect each other, and keep flying. The audience stood in a wave of applause. Cameras caught the tears glistening on her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. They weren't weakness. They were truth. After the event, Marcus approached with his signature calm smile. You were remarkable, he said. Aisha exhaled, almost laughing. I was terrified. That's how you know it mattered, he replied. Evelyn joined them, her uniform crisp, her presence grounding. You both know this isn't the end, she said. It's just the beginning. The sky's big enough for change. Hours later, Aisha boarded her new route Flight 628 to Seattle. It was a clear day. The kind of day that made the clouds look like floating continents. In first class, passengers chatted softly, unaware they were flying with two people who had helped change aviation policy. Midway through the flight, a little girl in row 4 waved shyly at Aisha. She had dark curls and big brown eyes. Her mother leaned in and whispered, "She wants to be a flight attendant one day." Aisha smiled warmly and knelt beside the girl. "Is that so?" The girl nodded. "My teacher showed us your story at school. She said you were brave." Aisha's heart clenched. "You know what bravery is?" she asked gently. The girl shook her head. "It's when you do the right thing even when you're scared. So, if you ever face something unfair, promise me you'll speak up. That's how we make the world better, one voice at a time." The girl nodded solemnly. "I promise." Aisha reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver pin, a pair of miniature wings she had worn during her training days. "Here. Keep these safe. Someday, when you fly, you'll need them." The girl's eyes widened in awe. "Thank you." As Aisha stood, her chest felt full, heavy in the best way. The moment reminded her of why she loved this job, not for the destinations, but for the humanity in motion. When the flight landed, the passengers applauded softly, and Aisha noticed a familiar reflection through the cockpit glass. Evelyn looking back at her, smiling proudly. Later that evening, Aisha sat on the rooftop of her small Atlanta apartment. The skyline glowed like a field of stars. Beside her lay a letter she had received earlier from the Federal Aviation Administration. It congratulated her on her contribution to new national protocols, mandatory bias and dignity training for all U.S. airlines. The Ross-Carter standard was officially part of aviation law. Her phone buzzed, a message from Marcus. "They passed it? It's real now. You changed the system, Aisha." She typed back, "No, we did." The wind lifted her curls as she looked toward the dark horizon where distant planes blinked like slow-moving constellations. She thought of Evelyn, of Marcus, of that terrified woman who once stood in the aisle covered in food and humiliation. How far she'd flown since then, not just in miles, but in spirit. She whispered to the night, "We made it. Mama." The next morning, the newspapers carried the headline, "Airline implements Ross-Carter standards nationwide. Dignity is not negotiable." The article included a photo of Aisha and Captain Ross shaking hands, smiling beneath the banner that read, "A new era in the skies." But beyond headlines and accolades, what mattered most were the unseen ripples. A young pilot in training stood taller during a briefing. A flight attendant in Texas reported discrimination for the first time and was taken seriously. A teenage girl in Detroit watched a documentary about Flight 473 and decided to pursue aviation engineering. Aisha's story wasn't about punishment or fame. It was about restoration of trust, of fairness, of faith in humanity. That evening, she received a video call. It was Marcus. He looked relaxed, wearing casual clothes for once. "I just wanted to say," he began, "thank you. Not for what happened that night, but for what came after. You didn't let anger win." Aisha smiled. Anger burns fast. Purpose lasts. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You ever think about what's next?" She looked out the window where the last light of day met the rising stars. "Keep flying," she said simply. "There's still sky left." The camera panned out slowly, fading into the image of a plane cutting across the deep indigo sky. Somewhere inside that plane, passengers laughed, slept, dreamed unaware that their peace existed because two people, once strangers, chose to stand up for dignity when silence was easier. And as the plane ascended higher, its lights blinking like small promises in the darkness, a single truth echoed through the clouds. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it soars. The story of white passenger disrespects black flight attendant. Pilot's shocking response stuns. Airline reminds us that dignity is not a luxury reserved for the powerful. It's the foundation of humanity. Aisha Carter's quiet strength and Captain Ross's courage show that respect is an action, not a slogan. In life, we all face moments when silence feels easier than confrontation, but silence often protects the problem, not the person. True progress begins the moment someone decides to speak up, not out of anger, but out of principle. For older generations, this story carries a timeless truth. It's never too late to stand on the side of what's right. You don't have to be on an airplane to make a difference. Every time you defend someone's worth, treat others with fairness, or refuse to look away, you become part of that quiet revolution called decency. Because respect doesn't depend on status or skin color, it depends on courage, and courage, at any age, can change the sky. Thank you for staying with us through this journey of courage and compassion. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like. It truly helps more people discover stories that matter. Share it with someone who believes in fairness, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales of justice, empathy, and hope. Together, let's keep these conversations alive, because dignity is never negotiable.